In this video, I want to look at effective revision strategies, but also give some rationale to why they work. The best place to start is to look at how we learn and, unfortunately, how we forget. This is a basic diagram of how our memory works. There's three distinct parts to this diagram that just need a little bit of explanation. Now, this is a really simplistic way of looking at this, but it hopefully helps to outline how these revision strategies are going to help you to learn and help you to remember. So our first part is the environment, and really what we're concentrating on here is our attention. We can only attend to a small amount of things at one time. So we need to make sure that we direct our attention to the things that we want to learn. So with that in mind, we need to consider the environment in which we're learning in, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment. The second part is our working memory. Our working memory is where we process information that we hear, that we see, and we can only process a really small amount of information, what we consider to be a few small pieces of information. If we try and take in too much information, we basically get overload, and our working memory can't cope with too many things. So if I was to give you a number to remember with a number of digits in it, and there was only 3 or 4 digits, it would be quite easy for you to retain. But if I gave you one with maybe 15 digits in it, it'd be really hard for you to remember because your working memory can't hold on to that much information. The third part is our long-term memory, and ultimately we want things to go to our long-term memory so they're stored there for us to be able to use at a later date. The only way to commit things to our from our working memory to our long-term memory is by using them regularly. You'll know that things that you can remember, what we would say off the top of our head, because you've thought about them multiple times, you've maybe spoken about them, read about them, used them, and therefore it's things that you know, and things that you can remember because you've committed them to your long-term memory. But that's happened over a process of lots of usages of that information rather than being told something and you remember it forever, because that unfortunately isn't the reality. The reality is that we actually forget things. We either have things that never enter our long-term memory, something that you've been told, and at the time you think, oh yeah, I know that and I understand it, but it doesn't take long for it to be just lost, and we just forget it. It falls out of our working memory and we never remember it. We also have things that we've committed to our long-term memory, but unfortunately over time, if we don't think about them or use them, then gradually we forget. And I'm sure we can all think of things that we learned in parts of our lives where at the time we really knew all about it, but because we never used it, that actually it just fades over time. And that's a consideration that we need to take into account for our schooling, because obviously we learn things that we are going to have to retrieve at a later date in assessments, using them in tasks, and specifically in formal exams. So that's a really basic model of the sort of three parts of learning. So in terms of our attention and getting that information into the working memory, and hopefully over time committing that information in our working memory to our long-term memory and holding on to it. So how are we going to make sure that we maximise the opportunities for learning? So unfortunately, we have forgetting. And this graph represents the forgetting curve, and it shows how much information we're likely to retain over time. And the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve has been around for nearly a century, and in terms of its usage, it's still used today. And it shows that over time, we gradually forget information. So the moment we're told it, we know it and we retain it. But within around 20 minutes, we may have forgotten up to nearly 60% of that information is now being retained. So we've forgotten around 40%. And you can see as time progresses over the hours and days following, that we're going to have forgotten the majority of that information unless we do something about it. And what I mean by doing something about it is to revisit it, to think about it, to see it, to use it. And that will help us to stop forgetting. And the best way to think about this is things that in your life that you do know lots about and that you can remember. There's a likelihood that you have used or thought about those things many times, therefore they've been committed and strengthened within your long-term memory. So with regards to how we can use revision strategies to make sure we maximise these three parts of our memory model, is to make sure that we take in strategies that are going to make sure that we don't have limited attention, we don't overload our working memory, and we use the best strategies to make sure things are committed to our long-term memory and then they stay there. because ultimately if they stay there, when we have to sit down and do an assessment, then we should be able to pick it out of our long-term memory by remembering and bring it down into our working memory to be able to put it down on a page in an examination. So with regards to our first section about the environment that we're in and our attention, as mentioned, we can only attend to a small number of things at one time. Anything additional is going to be a distraction. So we need to make sure that we do everything we can to zone in on the task in hand and the information in hand. And with regards to doing that, we need to limit those distractions. And one of the key ones is to try and remove distractions. And there's research to show that even just having a mobile phone nearby can give us a 20% reduction in attention and concentration, and therefore limiting our performance. Now, an easy strategy here would be simply to remove that distraction. Try and put that phone, either turn it off, take it out of the room, even better, for that short revision period that you're going to do. I'm going to recommend later that revision periods are somewhere around 30 to 45 minutes. So it's not a long amount of time to have to not have your mobile phone. But the distraction of a phone can actually be even the thought of it being there and checking it, let alone going on it and looking at messages from friends or going on Instagram or whatever it might be. That is going to detract from the success of that revision period. So try and remove your phone and any other obvious distractions from the area that you're trying to revise in. Our second tip regards music. Now, often students think that listening to music is a really good way to help them relax, which will in turn help them revise more effectively. But unfortunately, it's totally the opposite. That the words that we hear during music take up some of that limited working memory space. So even if we don't think they are doing, our brain is ticking over hearing those lyrics and actually making sure that we kind of attune to them and maybe sing along with them, even if it's not literally singing along. Our brain is singing along and it's picking up the words. So unfortunately, lots of us think this is the case, that we would be listening to music to help me revise, but actually it's a distraction. Not necessarily a distraction that we directly know, but it is taking up some of our brain's capacity to work, and therefore we can't retain as much information as we'd like to in the working memory, making it more difficult to encode it into our long-term memory. So exactly here, as we've seen, that information going into our working memory, we've just put something additional into our environment that actually is taking up some of our attention. And it will also take up some of the space in our limited working memory, meaning actually we're not making that revision session quite as effective as it could be. These stats show from the study that the difference between correct answers between people who were listening to music that they either liked or disliked was really similar. Music with no lyrics was slightly better because the brain didn't have to pick out words and different things that your brain could sing along to. But silence was our best bet. So again, trying to limit those distractions and limit the load on working memory. We should reduce the chances of that happening by removing mobile phones, but also making sure that that environment that we're working in is close to quiet as possible. So try to reduce distractions that you can choose. Sometimes there are distractions in your environment that you can do nothing about, but when there are, try to take them away. And with working memory in mind, we need to do everything we can not to overload that working memory, because it is limited. We can't take in too much information, and we can't take in information for extended periods. So our best way to do that is to look at spacing our revision. And what I mean by spacing is that rather than saying I'm going to revise for 3 hours or I'm going to do 4 or 5 hours block of revision, we need to make sure that we break that up into usable parts that are going to be successful, that are going to maximise the time that we're doing. So my suggestion would be that you would split your subjects over different days. So you'd seek to do 30 to 45 minutes of a subject on consecutive days rather than cramming it all into a 2, 3, 4 hour block of revising that subject. And the best way to do this is to set out a plan in order to make it work. And studies have shown that if students are able to space that information over time, they are much more likely to hold on to it. And you see the chart there for correct responses, that the study showed that people who spaced their revision actually were far more successful in retaining and getting accurate responses to exam questions. This is purely because your working memory can only cope with so much information over so much time. So therefore it actually becomes really ineffective once we start having revised for blocks that run into hours, because our working memory can't cope with it and we're very, very unlikely to remember it. So try to space your revision into small blocks of time over days, or if you are doing multiple subjects within a day, limit it to 30 to 45 minutes per subject, and then try to take a break before you do another revision session. So our key takeaway there: revising blocks of around 30 to 45 minutes to maintain attention and not overload the working memory, and trying to space this either during days, if you've got a day of revision, split it into blocks, and also split it over time. So doing little and often is far better than big long blocks of revision. Our next point directly complements that by trying to interleave different areas within a subject, or even better, different subjects. There have been studies showing that students who interleaved, which means doing different subjects in different revision blocks rather than blocks of one subject all the way through their revision sessions, allowed them to be far more successful in accurate responses in exams. And this was down to the fact that the brain was able to move between more agilely between different subject areas and different types of question, rather than just repeating the same sort of information that didn't challenge the brain quite as much. By moving between different subject areas or distinctly different topics within a subject, the brain has to work to be able to pick out what information do I need from this topic area, and then, oh, this is totally different. The brain has to work in a different way for a different topic or a different subject, rather than doing stuff that is all quite similar. Therefore, the brain power that's required is a little bit less. So an example here would be that if you were seeking to do an hour and a half's revision in an evening, rather than doing an hour and a half across one subject or one topic area, splitting it into 3 30-minute blocks with breaks where we studied 3 distinctly different things, ideally 3 different subjects, and that will allow us to do little and often of subjects dotted throughout a week. So our key takeaway there is to try and mix up your topics or different subjects within a revision session. And so therefore we can make sure that we build in some breaks, but also allow the brain to become more flexible, having to think differently about different subjects and different topic areas, which challenges it more, makes you think harder, which ultimately means you're going to remember stuff far, far better. If we now revisit our model and look at how we're going to get information to go from our working memory and hopefully be stored in our long-term memory, we really need to look at effective strategies to make sure that when we are looking at information and using information for revision, that we're able to do the best activities to make sure that they are going to be committed to the long-term memory. Because ultimately, when we walk into examination rooms and assessment rooms, we are not going to have notes with us. We are going to have to think and try and draw it from our memories. And ultimately, if it's in our long-term memory, we should be able to draw it down to our working memory to be able to put pen to paper and answer questions. So strategies that we need to consider all revolve around what we call the testing effect, and it's also known as retrieval practice. And ultimately what this means is that we need to think about things rather than just reading over notes and highlighting them and then just reading over them again. We need to make sure that we are looking at information and then testing ourselves from memory to make sure that it works. Studies have shown that students who simply study and don't test themselves, although they feel much more confident because they've seen the information lots and lots of times, they get what we call the illusion of knowing. And the illusion of knowing is basically, this looks familiar to me, so therefore, oh yeah, I remember this. Especially if it's in your handwriting, there's a fair chance that it will come back to memory to some degree because you put pen to paper. But actually that doesn't mean you know it, and you won't know you know it until you sit down in an environment where you're being asked to recall it. So the best study strategies involve studying and testing and testing and testing. And these were results of a study that showed that nearly 30% better outcomes were achieved by those who studied, test. So what I would like to show you is strategies that allow us to do that test. Now, what we mean by test is not that you're going to sit exam after exam having looked at some of your information. It's strategies that test you to think about that information and recall that information, because we're able to strengthen our long-term memory by multiple recalls of information. And memory is what we call the residue of thought. And what we mean by that is that if we think about things, it's much more likely to stick in our brain than just hearing it and reading over it over and over again. We need to think about it and wrestle with that information. So I'm going to outline some strategies now that are going to help us to achieve that. So how can we use the idea of retrieval practice and the testing effect for successful and time-efficient revision? What we want to make sure that we're doing is revision that works, but also we want to make sure that we're utilising our time the best. We've got multiple subjects to revise with lots and lots of content. We don't want any wasted time. We want to make sure we get a real bang for our buck when we do revision, rather than feeling like, yeah, I've sat there and I've looked at my books and I've looked at my work and I've done it for an hour, but I don't really feel like I've moved on. We need to make sure that we're able to set up an environment where we feel successful, but also we know it's been efficient. So first strategy that we want to consider is using look, cover, write, check. Now we can use this for any type of information where we look at some information, we cover it over, we write down some or all of that information depending on what we've chosen to do, and then we check it. And then we can use notes if we wish to correct that and add anything, or we can take a look, we can then cover it over again, and then we can add to those notes. Now, the best way to do this for foundation knowledge that we need in all of our subjects is to use knowledge organisers to do this. They've been designed in such a way that they don't hold so much content within each box that it's really hard to recall. So it allows us to have it in a really efficient way. Now, if we are making sure that we've got the foundation knowledge to be able to approach any question, because without that knowledge it's going to be hard to explain it, develop it, evaluate it, we need to know it first. I would recommend that using knowledge organisers to make sure we've got that foundation knowledge is really, really important. You have them in every topic for every subject. So use the look at a section. So for example, on the screen right now, you could look at section A, you could read through those definitions and then put that knowledge organiser to one side, and then you would write down your responses to 1 to 11. You may wish to write down 1 and the word that needs explaining all the way down the page and simply then write the definitions. But causing your brain to have to retrieve that strengthens the opportunity for that to be committed to your long-term memory. Exactly as I've said from the start, that if we keep revisiting things and having to think about them, we're much more likely to encode them to our long-term memory. So look, cover, write, check can be used for all sorts of different information, but it's best used with things that are relatively short and snappy to allow us to be able to be really effective with the time that we use using that strategy. As mentioned, just highlighting and reading over notes and classwork is not going to commit it to your long-term memory. So try, if you can, if you've got some notes on a particular topic area, use the same look, cover, write, check and make notes from memory. They're not going to be perfect, but they're going to be far more efficient at allowing you to be able to think about the content, but also identify what you do know and don't know. Because if you can't write it down, the chances are you don't know it, because obviously it was not in your memory to draw down from your long-term memory to your short-term memory. So actually it's not there. And this is a really good way of needs analysis, because you can actually go, well, I wrote all these things down, but oh God, I didn't even think about that. I don't know that. So now we've already found the bits that you need to revise more effectively. And there's a number of strategies we can do to do this. So we first could use something called a brain dump, which simply is you dumping down onto the page everything you know about a subject area. So you may wish to look at your notes first if you want to. However, it's really good to start without looking at your notes. So you take a topic area from a revision guide, for example, that may cover 1 page of a revision guide, and you put down everything you can remember about that topic area. And then check your notes and then cover those over, and then try and add anything that you missed. Check them a third time and then think, I've missed that as well. Close those notes and then try to add those things again from memory. And each time you do that, you are hopefully committing that information more strongly to from your working memory, hopefully to your long-term memory. And being able to do that, you will now have a notes page. A really good way to use that down the line is to be able to go, in a week's time, I'm going to have a quick scan over that and see if I can replicate it. Because if you can, then you are starting to make sure that that's in the long-term memory. So how can I do this for using it with notes? Because you may have books of notes, or indeed you may use revision guides. So you can do exactly as I've discussed. You can pick a specific topic, read over those notes, close them, take a short break if you want to really test whether you can remember it or not. Then list all of the key points. Once you've listed all of the key points, it's worth revisiting them and going, can I add to that? Can I explain why that thing has happened? Or how does it work? Or what happens next? Or what caused it to happen? If there's any elaboration that you think, well, actually questions are tending to ask me to explain this thing rather than just name it, can I do that? And if I can't, go back to my notes and study it and then have another go. So you can use this method of sort of using what's in your brain in the first place to dump it down onto a page and then try and elaborate on it further down the line to add to additional notes. Another way to do this is to review your notes and say that you're just going to put a topic into a handful of bullet points. So you may choose to just do 3 bullet points, and you're going to make them really sharp, really short, not too many words, and then take a look back at your notes, see if you missed anything important, and then close those notes and write an additional bullet point or 2. So you're reducing that information. You're really having to think about what's in that topic area to reduce it down to some really clear short bullet points, because that's quite a tough process and again involve lots of thinking. And as I keep mentioning, the thinking, the wrestling with information is what helps you commit it to long-term memory. And this is what we mean about the testing, the test. It's not about sitting and doing exam question after exam question. It's about testing yourself to recall things and strengthening that memory. Another way to do it is to transform that. So you could take a paragraph from a subject area and put it into a flowchart with keywords, or some sort of diagram may actually sum it up really well. You may be able to draw something and draw a working model of it that actually contains all the things that you need to know. Alternatively, you can transform it the other way. You may have in science a biological process, for example, that can be shown diagrammatically, but in the exam, you're clearly going to have to put it into words. So actually taking a diagram and then shutting that book and trying to write what that diagram shows in words as a process is quite a hard think task as well. Again, it's a test. So it's making your brain work really, really hard to wrestle with that information to try and retain it to the long-term memory. A very obvious way to test ourselves is past papers. And if you can get hold of past papers from websites from your exam board, ask your teachers, or any other type of exam practice questions, these are a really, really good way to test your knowledge. Clearly, they make you think about topic areas, and also you can then revisit those answers and spot gaps. Again, a needs analysis to go, right, well, I knew all this stuff and I've remembered it. I don't need to carry on revising this. I need to make sure now that I target my revision around these things that I couldn't answer. I would always tend to use past papers towards the end of our revision, because clearly you want to have done the revising first, and these are very much going to be specifically asking you about various different things rather than you perhaps controlling the revision and looking at, I'm just looking at this topic area, whereas past papers are clearly going to ask you various questions that jump around within the whole subject that you're studying. Therefore, it's recommended that you probably use these as part of your revision, but obviously slightly more towards the end of the revision period when you've had time to consolidate your knowledge. Another great revision strategy is to use flashcards. You can use them really effectively to retrieve information. What I would recommend is you don't add too much information to each card. So ideally, a question with an answer on the other side, a definition, so a term and a definition on the other side. That would be the best way to go. Too much information is really hard to replicate and be able to say everything that's on that card, and you'll feel like you're not being successful if there's too much on there and you miss bits out. Some easy ways to use them is to self-test. So recreate the flashcard, read the question or the term and write down the definition or answer on a bit of paper. Or you can ask somebody at home or a friend, a sibling, to be able to ask you those questions, so they can simply read out the term or the question and you verbally give them back the answer to that. Now, it's really important to think about using verbal response in your revision, because it's time efficient and it is very similar to you actually writing it down, but it takes a lot less time to say it than to write it. And it uses the brain, you're still thinking, you're still able to consider the information, you're just not spending that extra bit of time writing it down. Now, the other thing that's really good by using somebody else is that they can hold you to account. So if you don't get it quite right or you miss out a keyword, they can say, oh, that's not the word it says on here, I'm looking for a different word, which forces you to think again and go, yeah, the word I should have used was X. And that's really, really important, because we often, when we do it ourselves, go, yeah, that's near enough right, that'll do. But actually, if we want to maximise marks on assessments, near enough right perhaps doesn't always win. We want to be perfectly right with the perfect terminology. And having somebody else who we've said to them, if I don't get the words quite right, will you say? And they can say, oh yeah, you're kind of right here, but I need a different word. What other word could you use here? And they can help prompt you towards that. Even if they have no knowledge of what you're studying, the answer's there in front of them. So they don't need to be a specialist in history or geography or whatever. The answers are there for them to use. A really good way to do flashcards is using something called the Leitner System. And you simply make a load of flashcards and you can have 3 boxes. If you look on YouTube, you can see the Leitner System being used in various different ways. I've selected 3 boxes here. And what happens is you simply put all of your cards in box number 1 to begin with. And over time, they're gradually going to make their way to box number 3. Let me talk you through how that's going to work. So what happens is you've got 3 boxes. I've coloured them in different colours as well as numbered them, however you want to do it. So all of your questions start in box number 1. When you visit box number 1 and answer some questions, if you get it right, it goes to box number 2. If you get it wrong, it stays in box number 1. And over time, you will hope that more and more cards will move their way to box number 2. You've got them right once. Later in your revision period, you'll visit box number 2, which I'll show you how that works in a minute. And if you get it correct a second time, it progresses to box number 3. If you get it wrong, it goes back to box number 1. And what this allows us to do is make sure that we overlearn information that we know or think we know. And what I mean by overlearn is actually let's check a few times that I really do know it, rather than maybe just a lucky answer that I managed to pluck out the air. I actually know it. And by the time it gets to box 3, there's a fair chance I've remembered it. But if I got it right once, but then don't get it right again, the chances are I haven't remembered it, and it now returns to box number 1. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to visit box number 3 every 3 days. We're going to visit box number 2 every 5 days, and we are going to visit box number 3 every 14 days, because ideally by the time it's got to box number 3, we don't need to check it very regularly because we probably know it. And we can use this by setting up a little revision schedule. You may consider that each day we are going to do every 3 days, 5 days and 14 days on a calendar, which I'll show you in a moment. And I'm just going to do 15 minutes of flashcard revision. And I'm going to book that in every day that appears on my calendar just for 15 minutes. I won't get through all my cards, but I will get through as many cards as it takes me in 15 minutes. Okay, you may wish to do longer, but it's really good goal to make sure that you've set out a time and hopefully when you're going to do it. So not just 15 minutes, but every day I'm going to do it at this time for this amount of time will help us stick to it. And this is how it might look, that on our calendar, I've used different coloured blocks here to show this, but you can see if that was a month, that on the first of the month, I'm just going to look at box number 1 for 15 minutes, and any cards that I get right are going to jump to box 2. Any cards that I don't get right are going to stay in box 1. You'll see then I visit box 1 again on day number 3 of the month, so on the Monday. I'm now going to carry on with any cards that remain in there, either staying in there if I get them wrong, or moving to box 2 if I get them right. You'll see on the 5th of the month, the Wednesday, that now I'm going to spend 15 minutes just looking at things that have progressed to box 2. If I get those correct, they're going to move on to box 3. If I get them wrong, unfortunately, I don't know them and they're going to go back to box number 1. And you can see this carries on throughout the month to allow us to do some short, snappy revision that allows us to visit the things we don't know regularly, because they'll always hang about in box number 1 and we'll have to keep thinking about them until we get them right. The ones that we do get right, we visit a little bit to make sure we really know them. So the blue days, we're visiting stuff we have got right once, but now we're going to get it right, hopefully again, and get it to the red number 3 box. And then there's 2 opportunities during that month to look at the things that have made it to box 3, and we get that final opportunity to make sure we really do know it. The best way to do this is to get some highest leverage flashcards. And what I mean by highest leverage is the things that I really struggle with the most. Don't make flashcards on things that you think you already know and are very likely to get right. As much as it makes us feel good, it's probably wasting time. Do flashcards on the things, I never remember that, or I really struggle with this question. Write it on a flashcard, stick it in box number 1 and test yourself on it. Okay, and that is the best way to do this. I would personally mix in all of my flashcards from various different subjects, so my brain's got to be really agile at picking out different information. So it's not going to just be maths question after maths question or geography question after geography question. It's going to jump around between our different subject areas over that time period. So what I would recommend is that this makes up a small portion of your revision plan. So you may have revision scheduled in for certain days within a week that may look like this calendar, and you may do 15 minutes of flashcards and you maybe do 45 minutes of another subject in that evening. Okay, hopefully if you've got time you may do a second 40 minutes or 30 minutes of another subject as well in the run up to our exams. But we need to make sure that we schedule this, and it's really easy to schedule. You can use my model that's on the screen for any month or any period by looking to try and split up every 3 days for box 1, 5 days for box 2, because we hopefully know that a bit better, and we ask box 3 even less regularly because we should hopefully know that over the long term, because we've now got that answer right 3 times. Okay, so that is called the Leitner or Leitner method. That you can find this described on YouTube as well if that's not quite done it for you. Final note I want to talk about is cramming. And we hear lots of things about, don't cram for exams. And that is true. Trying to cram loads of information into your short-term memory is not going to ultimately mean that you're going to remember it. However, the one time it is worth doing something that people would consider cramming is to revise the night before. You need to make sure that you do go over some key areas depending on the subjects that you've got that next day, and go over those key bits of information, especially those ones you struggle with the most. Although we aren't necessarily going to commit stuff to our long-term memory by trying to cram it in at the last minute, we will retain some of it. Okay, we saw the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve can take quite a long time for all of that information to fall out of our brain. In fact, we only lose about 80% of information over 31 days. If you're looking at information the night before a morning exam, the chances are you will retain some of that information. So although I don't want you to spend 2 or 3 hours the night before trying to cram as much information into your head as possible, because it will not work, do make sure that you do go over key points for a short amount of time the night before, especially those ones you struggle with the most. Okay? It's not considered cramming, but it is still last minute revision, but it's really, really important. Finally, I want to look at how we put all this into action. How do we put this into a study plan that's actually going to work? So the first thing I need to do is make sure I know what I need to know from all of my different subject areas. And if I'm going to break that down into topics or units, and I need to make sure I have a list really that I can kind of check off that I'm really comfortable with this information. So I may highlight it in green and go, I do know this and I've tested that I know it. And then areas that I struggle with the most may be highlighted in a different colour. So I know that I can actually start to focus on that. You may then want to check it off as you go along, and once you feel much more comfortable with topic areas, cross them off or tick them so you can see your progress as you move forward. It's really motivating to see that you're making progress and that you are remembering stuff. So a checklist is a really good place to start, because if we don't know what we need to revise, then we're struggling. In point 2, we need a timetable. We need to make sure that we've got a timetable that tries to split up our revision. So as we've mentioned about spaced retrieval, having short blocks of time. And it's really important that we put those into a calendar. If we're going to use the Leitner method as well for using our revision flashcards, it's worth putting those in there too. So it may be that on a Monday night that I'm going to schedule some flashcard time, which could be multiple subjects, and I'm going to schedule in 2 30-minute blocks, one of physics and one of maths. And that might be how my evening looks. But we need to make sure that any timetable that we create is realistic and it is achievable. It's really easy to write down that I'm going to do 3 hours every night. It's not very realistic that I'm going to actually do that because things get in the way. We need to make sure we work around any commitments that we've got. So if we are still playing different sports or going to different clubs or whatever it might be, still do those. Okay, they are a big part of what we need to make sure that we do. We need to look after ourselves. We still need to take exercise. We still need to take breaks. We still need to do the things that we enjoy. We just need to build around them and make sure that this is an achievable plan. So if that means you can't revise on a Tuesday and a Thursday because you have a particular club that you attend, then don't try and force it in because you know probably it's more likely than not that you're not going to do it. Put it in at times where you don't really have an excuse not to do it and build in something that covers everything so you've built in enough time but isn't totally unrealistic, because once you start to not do those revision sessions, you go, well, I've not done it all week, so I'm not going to do it now. You want to make sure that you can tick off those sessions and go, yeah, this is achievable. I'm doing little and often, and that needs to start now ahead of any upcoming assessments. And then we need to make sure that we use those effective time-efficient strategies that I've outlined. So don't keep rereading and highlighting stuff and hoping that it's gone in. That illusion of knowledge is not knowledge, it's just familiarity. And when you sit down and try and put pen to paper, I guarantee you won't remember most of it. Don't, by all means, highlight the things that you do want to learn or want to know, but then we need to do that test. That doesn't mean sitting down and doing lots of test questions all the time. Test means think about it. I've closed the notes, it's blank paper. Whatever strategy I'm using, I've got to think. That's the test. You trying to retrieve it from your memory. So use those effective revision strategies that have been outlined. Our next bit is from those effective strategies, when you get stuff right really regularly, you know it, okay, and you can move on. But make sure that you identify the areas you don't know. And one of the biggest problems we see with revision is students going, oh, I'm going to revise this tonight because I quite like this. And generally students quite like things because they know it. And unfortunately, we do want to overlearn things, but what we often do is use time ineffectively by revising things that we're pretty good at because it makes us feel nice and warm and fuzzy, and avoid the things that we really struggle with, that we barely even remember doing at school. And so therefore we feel like we've got to reteach them a little bit. Well, unfortunately, we have forgotten them to that degree. We need to do it. We can't just avoid them. So be really honest with yourself and don't focus on the stuff that you think, yeah, I probably already know this, but I don't mind doing 30 minutes of this, because it's not too taxing. It's not a big test for the memory. Try and do things that you really struggle with. This will allow you to identify those gaps in your knowledge when you just can't get it right. And once you've identified those gaps, I need you to repeat 3 and 4. So those revision strategies on those things, and then that assessment of, do I know them, don't I know them? Because we need to make sure that we don't just go, oh, I don't really know it, and then we leave it. We need to identify the gaps and try and plug those gaps by revisiting it again. And obviously, the harder you have to think, the more likely you are to remember. All of the strategies I've outlined involve thinking, and thinking is the key to this. That if we are able to think hard about things, we are much more likely to commit them to long-term memory. So think about your plan it out, use the strategies that work for you within this guidance, and do your level best to plan something that allows you to access as many subjects as possible in short blocks of time, and don't overload your working memory. Reduce the distractions so you can attend to the thing you want to attend to, and think and test to try and commit that information to long-term memory. So when you walk into those assessments, it's up there, locked away in your long-term memory for you to bring down into your working memory and put onto the paper. If you have any questions about the way you should study, please ask your teachers, because they will be able to help you with these strategies and offer you guidance of where they think you should really focus your revision either on topics that they know are most likely to come up or are the most difficult, or your own individual plan, because they know you well, they've been teaching you for a long period of time. They'll be able to say, I know you're really good at this, but I would spend your time mostly on doing this. So use the professionals as well to make sure that they can guide you. Thank you so much for taking time to watch this video, and I really hope it helps you to revise successfully and efficiently and leads to lots of success in your upcoming assessments.